This is Dan Dix here, reporting for Press for Truth, and the federal Liberal government has announced that they are strengthening sanctions against Russians due to Russia's apparent aggression towards Ukraine. Now, Foreign Affairs Minister Stefan Dion says that Russia must conform to international obligations before the sanctions can be lifted. The expanded and now more restrictive sanctions, some of which target Russian individuals, came Friday as Russian President Vladimir Putin traveled to Crimea to mark the second anniversary of the uprising against Western-backed puppets. Now, according to the NATO-approved narrative, a peaceful protest movement emerged in Kiev against an oppressive government, causing Ukraine's dictator to flee the country. Then a pro-liberty government took its place. But so goes the narrative. An evil Putin invaded and conquered Crimea, engineering terrorist revolts in the eastern parts of the country. So, Putin is Hitler, the United States is God, and Bob's your uncle. Of course, guys, what actually happened is really quite different. The protesters weren't battling domestic oppression. It was over foreign policy and foreign aid. They wanted closer ties with Europe, but President Viktor Yanukovych rejected a European Union Association agreement over its strict regulatory framework. But far from being an organic movement, these protesters were heavily subsidized and sponsored by the U.S. government. Before this crisis broke out, the Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland bragged about the U.S. spending $5 billion in, quote, helping Ukraine become more Western-orientated. And far from being the peaceful demonstrators that Western corporate state media made them out to be, the protesters were violent. They were armed with weapons, and they were even hiring snipers. Yanukovych agreed to an early election, and he assented to U.S. demands, but all that did was allow the Nazis to seize government buildings. And I'm not using that term out of context here. The core element of the Euromaidan movement are literally Nazis. Their leaders are part of an unbroken lineal tradition that goes way back to Stepan Bandera, a Nazi collaborator who brought the Holocaust to Ukraine. So the new government was backed by foreign powers. It performed a coup, not a revolution. The country was, and still is, very heavily divided. The US-backed Ukrainian government sent Nazi paramilitaries into European neighborhoods to attack and kill ethnic Russians. In one eastern Ukrainian town, Marinka, the Nazis waved the Wolfsangel flag, a symbol that was used by Hitler's SS. So no, this isn't hyperbole to suggest that the US and Canada are backing Nazis. You know, given this situation, it made sense that the ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine would rebel against the Nazis, and far from trying to overthrow the government in Kiev, as the Western media reports on, they're actually trying to establish autonomy from it. The Russian government has been largely reactive against U.S. aggression. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact has ceased to exist. In contrast, NATO, the Western version of the Warsaw Pact, has expanded and pushed itself all the way to the Russian borders. Moscow warned Washington that Russia could not accept a hostile Ukraine. That'd be like if Mexico had a very anti-U.S. policy. Crimea is more Russian than Ukrainian, and it's been under Russian control since the 1700s. So Russia asserted that control, held a referendum, and thus Crimea was rightfully annexed away from the Western Nazis. It was a bloodless move, quite in contrast to the civilian-killing government in Kiev, or what the U.S. has done in the Middle East and North Africa for the last decade and a half. But the U.S. or Canada wouldn't recognize the referendum, and they made out Putin to be the aggressor, the bad guy in all of this. Now, Putin is not the greatest guy in the world, far from it, but at least he's been pushing for ceasefires and diplomacy. And this brings us back to Canada's sanctions. The Russian embassy in Ottawa issued a statement deriding the stricter sanctions. This is not how diplomacy is done, and it does not pave the way to an honest and mutually respectful dialogue, the statement said. And we agree. I mean, so much for Canada taking the peacekeeping role that these liberals often boast about. That sunshine and rainbows reputation that the Harper government apparently destroyed. In reality, guys, the new boss is the same as the old boss. Politicians are just puppets on a string. It's NATO who's the warmonger here, and Russia is the one who's on the defense. But Western corporate state media have got this whole thing backwards. You would think that modern-day Nazis attacking European cities and towns would be front-page news. But not so much when the Nazis are the allies of the West, murdering Russians and lining the pockets of the military-industrial complex. Thanks for watching, guys. Check the links in the description for all the sources to this video. And as always, my friends, press for truth.
That is most certainly an act of war. The West is using ISIS to attack Russia, and without the support of the West, well, the Islamic State just simply wouldn't have the means to be able to do any of this. They wouldn't have the funding, they wouldn't have the arms, they wouldn't have the money. They certainly wouldn't be able to take down a Russian airliner.